This is part 4 of A Bowl of Heaven, written by Evangeline Adams, one very famous astrologer who resided in Carnegie Hall in New York City. At the time of publishing, this book was published in 1926. Chapter 9, Some Ladies of Venus. You may by now have gathered that not all of my clients come from the sacred precincts of the social register, and it is true. A hostess who does not know whom she's entertaining until her guests in the room cannot hope to limit the circle of her acquaintances. In the past, I've tried. I've also deliberately avoided interviews with people presumably so far gone as to be beyond the ability to take advantage of even astrology's help. But it's no use. My secretaries hear nothing. Of the voice over the telephone, not always the voice of a would-be client either, and they are powerless against the easy subterfuge of an assumed name. So it happens that I've had more opportunity to study the seamy side of human existence than is usually accorded a woman of my inherited respectability. I'm glad of it. First, because I have proved to my own satisfaction that there are very few people in the world so far gone that astrology cannot help them to come at least part of the way back, and secondly, because I myself have received help of the most unexpected kind from men and women who see life's problems in the raw. Help, I mean, in understanding these problems myself and applying their lessons to the lives of many more limited clients. There's much to be learned from a man who runs a bank. But there is more to be learned from a man who robs one. There is something to glean from the experience of a girl who has had one lover. There's a library of knowledge in the story of a woman who has several. I have 2 cases very much in mind. A woman sent in to me the other day the dates of an extraordinarily interesting man, or rather a man with an extraordinarily interesting horoscope. 3 things in the chart stood out above everyone else. One was a desire to be before the public in a big way. Another was the worst possible combination of planets in dealing with the public. And the third was a decided tendency to fall into the clutches of the law. I felt sure the moment I looked at his chart that the owner was a man with a record. He was. His name was Ponzi, and his record has been spread all over the front pages of every paper in the country and has been dealt with in many of our courts in Massachusetts. Upon further study, I found the date when this would-be financial wizard was arrested and the various dates on which he was either convicted or jailed, coincidentally, absolutely, with the danger periods indicated in his chart. The second case is of a type that will be even more offensive to delicate sensibilities. I have a woman client who has been a court and newspaper figure for many years. She admits having kept a disorderly house. She boasts of getting various rich men by planting things on them and making them, quote unquote, come across. The vocabulary is her own, but I dare say it describes with great accuracy the nature of her activities. Well, my dear old Puritan ancestors, think of me what you will, but I profit much when I match wits with that young lady of crowded leisure. The only thing that troubles me about my relations with this client is that I can't do anything to make her see the desirability of turning her really remarkable talents into conventional grooves. I'll do it, she always says, whenever you can show me anything half as interesting as having the whole police force of New York camping on my trail. I'll never forget the first woman of this class who came to see me. It was in Boston in the very beginning of my practice, when I was seeing nobody professionally except my friends and their friends. A modestly dressed young woman, slightly inclined to blonde plumpness, presented herself at the door, mumbled something about having been recommended to me by a mutual friend, and gave me her dates. There was nothing in her appearance or manner which would indicate that she was a professional, but her horoscope had informed me, and something I said suggested that I was not wholly aware of her nature. She came right out with the astounding statement that she ran the best house in the Back Bay. I could have fainted if I had been the fainting kind. As it was, I swallowed fast and gulped. Who in the world sent you to me? Without the slightest embarrassment, I don't suppose there's any reason for her to feel any, she mentioned the name of one of my most distinguished clients, a college professor, and husband of a beautiful young wife. I can't say that this revelation lessened my surprise, but it loosened some of my inhibitions. If a professor could learn from this woman, I could too. And woman-like, the first thing I wished to learn was why this apparently exemplary husband with a wife who adored him in every way should be seeing a woman of this type and be a caller at even the best house in the Back Bay. I found out. And I found out many other things from that woman which have been inestimable assistance to me in dealing with the problems of husbands and wives. If the wife of that stray word professor had been my client instead of him, I could have told her a few things which would have materially assisted her in making a success of her marriage. As it was, she lived a miserable life, and her husband became a mental and moral wreck and died a miserable death. I was terribly sorry for the woman before me. Her story rang so true to the danger signals in her horoscope, and so true to the conventional storybook traditions of the country girl who goes wrong. She was born in a small city in New Hampshire, the daughter of a storekeeper on the main street. At 16, she fell in love with the inevitable salesman who sold goods to the father and sold himself to the girl. With her nature, there could be but one result, and after months of intrigue, she was persuaded to run away and take up a life with him in Boston. Of course, he was already married. They always are. And of course, when she found it out, there was a quarrel. There always is. And then another man, and another, until one richer than the rest set her up in business and put her in touch with Back Bay's most exclusive clientele. One of her patrons was the ne'er-do-well son of an old Boston family, with whom she proceeded to fall desperately in love. The first affair had been only physical. The intervening ones had been professional. This one sentimental. The boy had accepted her devotion for years. He'd even shared in the profits of her trade. But now his family were putting on the too long delayed screws, and they were forcing him, according to his story, to marry a girl of his own class. What my client wanted to know was how she could stop the marriage, and how she could keep her young man for herself, how she could get him to marry her instead of her rival. She'd saved some money. She was willing to slave until she had enough to support them both, assuming, of course, that the boy's family would promptly disinherit him. I could do very little for her in the way she hoped. Her chart showed, as did her life, that she would always be seeking love and meeting disaster. His showed him just the good-for-nothing person he was turning out to be. There wasn't the slightest chance that he would marry her, or that she would be happy if he did. I tried to give comfort where I could, to give hope, but I'm not sure that I accomplished much. I was very young, and in between the horror and experience, I fear I made a failure where today I think I could have been of considerable help. After I'd recovered from the shock of the interview, and wasn't a quick recovery either, I tried to take the conventional side of the incident. I tried to blame this young woman for her first wrongdoing. I tried to be glad that she had not succeeded in ensnaring this socially eligible young man, but I couldn't honestly do so. Not after what I saw in her chart and his. So I resolved that in the future, whenever a woman of this class came to me, I would deal with her impersonally as with any other client, and if she displayed an honest desire to raise herself out of the pit in which her tendencies had urged, I would not let squeamishness or prudery prevent me from giving her every bit of help in my power. And I've kept that resolve with surprisingly satisfactory results. I can recall at least 4 women similar to this young woman who've been able to, with astrology's help, extricate themselves from the coils of their profession and lead respectable lives. The most interesting of the 4 is now married to one of the richest men in Chicago. Her problem, when she first came to me, was not unlike the Boston woman's, but her history and nature were quite different. She was a foreigner whose family had sent her here on a very early age to pick up some of the gold they believed to be lying around on every American street. Of course, the child didn't find gold, but she did find hunger and a need for shelter for her head and shoes for her feet. She also found important letters from her family abroad. The rest of the story anybody can guess, but the usual stage is this young woman was not a bad sort, and who did not have a bad horoscope, found herself established on a profitable scale in Mrs. Warren's loathsome profession. She'd made good use of her money on the other side, and here her old father and mother lived in comfort, and they died in happy ignorance. Her 6 brothers and sisters, one by one, she brought to this country. Some she educated, others she established on a farm in New England. Her one ambition was to save enough money above those expenditures to retire and become a respectable woman, the respectable woman her family believed her to be. She too had fallen in love with a young man who had come to her place of business, and he, by some grace of the stars, had the insight to recognize the fine traits which lay below the surface in this extraordinary woman. They loved each other sincerely, and they still do. It was about him that she first came to see me, or rather about his father, who knew all about them and was quite naturally opposing their union with every means in his power. I believe I gave the woman and her lover courage to do the right thing, the wisdom as to the way they should do it. If I did, I'm in any way responsible for their present happy and respectable married life. I'm proud of myself and thankful to astrology. Let me emphasize now that my impersonal astrological service to women using their abilities in this nefarious business is necessarily the same type and sincerity that any service to any other worker whose business policy violates established standards of integrity. In all cases, astrology demands that I make it clear to my client that the clean, honorable, honest way is the only way, and in the end successful. I ever endeavor to inculcate into their consciousness the necessity of using their forces in a way that will encourage their spiritual development and the eternal values of life. Truly, my sympathies are often deeply moved in the sacrifice of these women whose trade it is by many authorities deemed to be a necessity to society, and even when my influence seems to fail, I still have hope and patience to believe that the truth of astrology may yet rescue them. Nor can I be indifferent to the horror of a sensitive and misused soul mixed in conditions from which it seems difficult to escape. I recall the woman who explained her extravagant frequent visits to me by a passionate declaration. If I couldn't come to you as often and breathe the air about which you know to believe the things you teach, I couldn't live. My job would drive me mad. Sometimes, of course, I not only fail to divert one of these crooked-minded people into the straight and narrow way, but quite inadvertently the information which I give them proves of inestimable advantage to their nefarious schemes. One woman, who kept a questionable resort somewhere in the roaring forties, subscribed by my monthly mail service for years without disclosing occupation. Later, when she saved up enough money to retire and open a shop on Fifth Avenue, she came to see me and told me all about herself, and added with charming, disarming naivety that I would never know how useful I had been to her in her previous business. I won't say I was shocked. It takes a good deal to do that after 30 years' practice in astrology, but I was hardly pleased to be regarded as a silent partner in such an undertaking. Yes, she said demurely, whenever my horoscope showed that I was coming under bad influences, I took double precautions against the police. But I do not hold incidents like these against the profession in general. I have suffered just as often from the most respectable clients. One woman, immaculate according to the social rules, but with a gift for intrigue that may sometimes be her undoing, victimized me quite as completely. She had 2 suitors, one very rich man, and one, as in the storybooks, far too poor. She gave me the dates of these 2 men, and I quite innocently told her what I saw, that the rich man was coming under the worst condition in his whole life, and although I did not actually predict his early death, I fear I showed my manner that I was pretty sure of it. She departed without emotion or indicating her preference between the 2 men, and presently I learned that she had married the rich man. A year later, her husband fulfilled his horoscope, dying suddenly and leaving her with all of his money. Within a week, she married the other man. These cases are exceptions. My clients usually play fair with me, and some of the squarest, as well as most graceful, are to be found in the ranks of those outcasts from society. One woman, highly connected to New York, who had declassed herself because of her love for a married man, came to see me for years with the problems of her difficult career. I did what I could for her, but I could not save her from her besetting sins, love of liquor and extravagance. The former stimulated the latter. When she had a drink or two, she would go to the veritable shopping jags, which kept her in debt. Fortunately, her married friend was generous as well as wealthy, and he seemed to have the greatest patience with her weaknesses. I suppose he felt responsible for the life which encouraged these tendencies, and in any case, he was very long suffering. You can imagine my surprise, therefore, when my telephone rang late one night and a tearful voice told me that its owner had been wandering around the streets all evening, locked out of her hotel because she hadn't paid her bill, and absolutely without any money to seek shelter anywhere else. Her friend, it seemed, had been away for some time on a business trip, and was still away. She dared not tell anybody else of her predicament, and she was helpless. There was only one thing to do, and I did it. That night the woman slept on the couch in my studio. She'd been drinking heavily and buying extravagantly. She needed both physical and financial aid. I couldn't pay her debts, but I could care for her and feed her, and so to meet her emergency. The whole matter was charity. I did not expect financial honor or that rare quality gratitude from a woman of her class, but she tried to and insist when she was more in the funds on paying me back every cent I'd spent on her. Incidentally, her long-suffering lover came to see me himself and to thank me for what I had done. And when he displayed a sense of financial responsibility, it amused me to allow him to pay his debt. He came again and again many times to consult me, not only with his relationship to this afflicted woman, but about his own business. He was a very large He was a man of very large interests, and aside from his weaknesses for women, a fine type. I do not count these cases from the underworld. They can make more out of me than anything else I do. That first interview in Boston prostrated me. I wasn't myself for weeks, and I have the same reaction even now on a less violent scale. But no case has given me greater satisfaction when they go right, and I am convinced after long experience that almost anybody, to use an evangelistic phrase, can be saved, but only through knowledge. The line between good and bad is a thin one, and we must know the forces with which we are dealing, and we must use them to keep on the right side. The horoscope shows these forces. Astrology shows us how to harness them for our own best ends. Mars may cause temper and inharmony, but its force can be transmuted into courage and the power to command opportunities. Venus may cause illicit love, but it can cause the poet to write a beautiful verse, or the humanitarian to build a beautiful city, or the ordinary man to provide his children with a beautiful garden in which to play. Every Saturn in its most advanced aspects can be diverted from some knowledge, from greed and jealousy and fear to constructive activity on the physical, scientific, or spiritual plane. Knowledge is the thing, and astrology is knowledge. Sometimes, especially in those who have a long way to climb, the upward progress is slow. But I'm no longer discouraged by delay. Who can expect to jump from being a slave to being a master? Just as the spectrum has no real demarcation, it is a continuous progression, changing according to the law of vibration. So within the human being, he must live, suffer, and grow to understanding by degrees. Huxley said it in his Huxley says it's logical to believe that there are beings as far in advance of a man as a man is in advance of that beetle. I go further. I say, after all these years of dealing with the finite and infinite, that there is no break from the tadpole to the absolute, from the weakest of human beings can climb. Chapter 10, I Never Gamble. Not all of my masculine questions have to do with money. The other day, a prominent New York doctor rushed into my studio with this demand: I want to know what's wrong with my stars. Nothing much, I replied after looking up from his chart, except those governing your stomach. That's all I want to know, he said, picking up his hat. I was thinking of having the darn thing removed, but now I know it'll be all right when the stars change. Politicians are frequent visitors. Managers wish to know which candidate to choose. Candidates wish to know when to offer themselves, and all kinds of people wish to know who is to be nominated. The pre-convention campaign in which Mr. Harding was finally chosen was a most puzzling one to me because of the stars in clearly indicated that none of the leading candidates had the slightest chance of winning. Political managers came to me repeatedly each time with a new horoscope. One of the prominent mentioned candidates was the late John W. Weeks of Massachusetts, who journeyed to New York to consult me. In the latter case, I was able to tell him that although he had no chance of obtaining the nomination for himself, he would profit greatly by the election. And he did, for he was immediately advanced to the position of President Harding's cabinet. But none of my researches discovered a candidate who could be nominated. Of course, no one offered me Mr. Harding's date. Most of us in New York had scarcely heard of him, but his horoscope clearly indicated his elevation to high office, as well as an early death. On the other hand, the election of Mr. Coolidge in 1924 was astrologically as well as politically a foregone conclusion. He was under the very best conditions, and so were several and more important leaders associated with him in the conduct of his campaign. So I had no hesitation in predicting his nomination an overwhelming triumph. But most of the questions asked me during the 1924 campaign did not concern Mr. Coolidge so much as did the outcome of the struggle of a New York governorship between young Teddy Roosevelt and Governor Al Smith. Most people thought Roosevelt would walk in on the Coolidge escalator, but the stars did not. And many of my clients profited by the knowledge. Everybody knows the result. In spite of a Republican landslide which elected every other Republican on the state ticket, young Teddy went down to lonely defeat. The margin between the two men was narrow, but astrology was absolutely certain of the result because Mr. Roosevelt was under the worst condition that will afflict his horoscope for 21 years. He never had a chance of winning that particular campaign for office, which his father had so ably filled. That young man's condition, I remember telling several of my clients before the election, are so bad that he couldn't be elected on a school board in his native village in Oyster Bay. In the same way, there are times when people are under what I call accidental conditions, which it seems almost impossible to escape injury. I have already told of my own vain attempt to dodge my stars by substituting a safer mount for my beloved Jupiter, and I recall a valued client who found himself in such an accidental period. On the strength of my warning, he kept out of automobiles, refused to go on his yacht, and did nothing for several days to attend actual imperative meetings of his boards. One morning, when he was seated with his knees tucked under a heavy director's table, one of the table legs gave way, and the table plunged in his direction and threw his right knee out of joint. I hesitate to think what might have happened to that man, or to me, if we had not heeded the best of our abilities the warnings of our astrology. My husband has just come through one of these periods. Being forewarned, he protected himself in every conceivable way and managed to come up the last day substantially intact. But that evening, a young friend of ours called asked if he could bring over 3 of his friends who were interested in astrology. Our new acquaintance proved to be the most interesting conversationalist, so much so that we talked to a late hour and then began to forage for something to eat and drink. I won't say what we found, but I will say that the cork from one part of it blew out with a great explosion and hit Mr. Jordan squarely in the right eye, smashing his glasses and threatening much more serious trouble. The 4 men rushed to Mr. Jordan's assistance, but I, true to my beloved horary, rushed to the studio. My guests thought I was crazy. Even my husband, suffering from intense pain, was surprised at my sudden desertion. But the comforting message I brought back to him was that no permanent injury would result from this mishap at this particular moment. And that was worth more to him than the most efficient demonstration of wifely first aid. Believe me, it was worth a lot to me too. Some years ago, an Englishman entered into my studio saying he'd come to this part of the world to go into the oil business. He was thinking of Mexico at the time, an almost virgin oil field. I told him he was coming under excellent conditions in the moment, that his stars were propitious for undertaking in the southern countries. He went to Mexico. He was one of the first men to open up there on a large scale. The next time I saw him, he'd made $6 million and was thinking of extending his interest to copper mining in Michigan in company with another client of mine. The situation was a tight one. The Englishman's stars were no longer favorable for new undertakings, and they never would be, for any enterprise in the northern climates or in association with a second man. Of course, I told him the truth as diplomatically as I could for the other man's sake, but at the time he believed he was bigger than the stars. People who make $6 million are apt to feel that way for a while. And before he was through with his northern venture and his partnered friend, he had just dropped half the fortune which the stars had made him. Theatrical gamblers, in which we may term every human being who puts money in the production of a play, came to see me to find a propitious time to begin rehearsals and to present their wares to the public. The only trouble, Daniel Frohman once said to me, is that we can't always follow your advice. We must produce new plays regardless of the stars, where theaters are available or other plays fail. Augustus Thomas is another theatrical personage who is much interested in astrology. At the time he was writing The Harvest Moon and Mere Man, both plays dealing with the occult, he was a frequent visitor at Carnegie Hall, not for the astrological readings, but more, as he used to say, to talk things over and settle down the affairs of the world. I don't say that Mr. Thomas believes in astrology. I'm not sure at all that he does, but a man need not argue with me to make acceptable conventional partner. In fact, there's no one I'd like to get a hold of so much in a good, thoroughgoing skeptic. There's something about the way you put it, a man said to me the other day, that makes me believe in it even if I can't believe in astrology. And perhaps it isn't astrology at all. Perhaps it's your intimate acquaintance with so many troubled souls. But when you get out of one of those funny-looking charts and begin talking the stars, I settle back in a comfortable chair, adjust my mentality to astrology's loudspeaker, and prepare to listen in on God. Another time, this man wrote to me, I won't say that your overwhelming mass of coincidences has convinced me. I still belong to that small group who would be put a bet on hard work to beat Aquarius or Pisces or Taurus in any race on the track. I cannot help feeling Napoleon's knowledge of tactics was of more use to him at Wagram than was the moon changing to be Capricorn, and I am inclined to think that Shakespeare's gift for merry quip is traceable to his early association with the gay lads of piping Pembroke, dancing Marston, and drunken Bidford, rather than the accident that the poet's Jupiter happened to be in the house of exaltation. At least I think that. I think all these safe, sane Republican Party, Calvin Coolidge, Best Family, Hearts of Oak thoughts when I am not in number 1003 Carnegie Hall. But we were talking about gamblers, not the skilled flatterers and prideful astrologers, and believe me, I have all kinds. Several years ago, a prominent racing man came to me with the horoscope of a certain colt. The reading showed the animal had energy, courage, endurance, and he would be extraordinarily swift in his movements, but he would also be subject to moods, would take violent likes and dislikes, and be very nervous and irritable. Evidently, he was potentially a splendid racehorse, provided that he was carefully handled by a trainer and a jockey he liked, but couldn't be depended upon if he came under influences antagonistic to this peculiar temperament. That colt's subsequent history, written large in the headlines of spectators' victories and spectacular disappointments, is convincing proof that the stars do not guess, they know. But sometimes they're puzzling even to astrologers. There's a woman in Santa Barbara who's worth millions of dollars. I've done work for her for years, and a month before the Santa Barbara earthquake, I wrote to her that she was coming under very bad conditions, and that if she were a poor woman or a stock speculator or in active business, I should be afraid of financial losses and worries. The earthquake came, it toppled over all the chimneys in her palatial home, destroyed valuable furnishings, art treasures, and resulted in great financial loss. This condition, which I foresaw in her case, is the same, which leads me to tell all people so afflicted to stay out of the stock market. One of my spectacular clients was an officer of the American Tobacco Company. I advised him on the occasion to stay out of the market until he came under better conditions. Take your wife to Europe, I said to him, and stay a year. You'll be money in the pocket even if you spend $100,000. The tobacco man told me afterward that he lost just $110,000 by staying home and playing the market. The problem is the same in any case, whether the element of chance enters. So much depends on the position of the planets at the time the enterprise is undertaken, and more important still, the position of the planets at the time of the man's birth. Can he or can he not win at games of chance? If people only had the wisdom to find the answer to the last question, much of the poverty and misery in the world could be avoided. When a man comes to me for advice on the stock market, and of course a great many do, I find out, first of all, whether the stars indicate he is to be fortunate in speculative transactions. If he is, I tell him the periods that he ought to be most propitious for such operations and the kinds of stocks in which he's most likely to be successful. I also give him the benefit of astrology's knowledge of the general conditions, the big swings and curves, and then I stop. But I never try to make day-to-day predictions on the market's course. I leave that for those who have not any astrological advantage. If, however, my visitor has a horoscope like my own indicating that he could hardly expect to be successful in stock speculation or any other game of chance, I give him the same advice that I give myself. Leave the stock market alone. But some people, even when they're forewarned, cannot stay away from the stock ticker and kindred games of chance. To such a manufacturer who would make large sums of money in his regular business and promptly lose them all in gambling. I once said I would like to look at your brains to see what's the matter with it. His horoscope indicated that he could not make money through playing games of chance, and I had told him this repeatedly. He replied, Miss Adams, you'll never be able to understand because you've not a gambler's brain. We always feel sure the next time we'll win, and we go on feeling this way to the end of our lives. I'm convinced that the gambler must always lose in the end. He's trying to get something for nothing, which is against natural law. Several investors among my clients have felt sure that they succeeded in inventing a perpetual motion engine, but I have found on all their horoscopes they were easily self-deceived. They too are counting on being able to beat natural law and get something for nothing. These men and women whose horoscopes indicate success, there are clearly men and women whose horoscopes indicate success in games of chance, and these people, so long as they realize the stock market is such a game, and so long as they play it at such times and in such ways as their horoscope indicates, frequently make money in Wall Street. All successful operators and most successful investors fall into this fortunate class. In fact, some have the money instinct written so large on their stars that the whole horoscope takes on a golden glow. By the way, a client said to me the other day, would you mind looking at March 24th, 1854, and telling me what you see? I spread out one of my blank horoscope charts with a great zodiacal wheel printed on it, and consulted the big book of figures which I call my astrological Bible, and scribbled with one of my fat little blue pencils and began to tell him what I saw. I don't know what your business is, maybe with this man, I said, but I don't see how you can lose if you get connected with him right. Why? Well, he has one of the best horoscopes for money that I have ever seen, and I wish he were handling mine for me. He handles too much of mine, he said, starting for the door. March 24, 1854, was Andrew W. Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury, and one of the 3 richest men in the United States. Mr. Cromwell used to say to me, Miss Adams, I believe you hold in your hands the key to the rise and fall of the stock market. What he meant was that I held it for some people. Of course, Seymour Cromwell would have been successful in the market whether he consulted an astrologer or not, because the stars had declared this success at his birth. But he was more successful because he kept informed of the movement of the planets. From time to time, the political, business, and financial conditions depended on those movements. The naturally unlucky player, if he availed himself of the same knowledge, might save himself from a certain measure of disaster, but he couldn't, even with astrology's guidance, hope to make money in the long run. It is only chance that I happen to fall among those who can't instead of those who can. Perhaps it's a lucky chance, because if I not only possess the key to the markets, but also the hand with which to unlock the door, I might be weak enough to desert astrology and give all of my attention to becoming the richest woman in the world. And it is that I get more of a thrill out of the fact that men like J.P. Morgan and Seymour Cromwell, with their fine minds, believed in the stars, and that they or anybody else could make money out of them. Naturally, when I see fortunate people making money as a result of advice which I have given them and realize that I am unable to profit the same advice, I'm a little downhearted. But on the whole, I prefer to have my regrets before than after losing dollars I work so hard to earn, and I am just proud of the number of people I've saved from the stock market, as I am of the number which I've helped guide to financial success. Fortunately, my tastes do not run to turbine yachts and private cars. I have a little retreat in the country, which I've converted into a friend's meeting house with a colonial cottage, and so I have the strength and the money to attend auctions, buy spinning wheels, and I expect to be happy. Fortunately, my tastes I believe everyone should have at least one hobby to take the mind off the serious work of life. Mine is antiquity. I turn to it instinctively whenever I find it in literature, art, and especially auction rooms. Years ago, when I found my recreation in remodeling old houses in the vicinity of Hebron, New Hampshire, there is no more beautiful country anywhere. Newfound Lake is a miniature Geneva or Cuomo, and the auctions are much more intriguing. I attend them all for miles around and succeed in collecting some rare colonial specimens, which now help me make an interesting little home in Yorktown Heights. Bidding on antiques of drawing plans for remodeling old houses seems to be complete relaxation I need after 6 full days of trying to solve other people's problems. My first retreat to Hebron was too far away from my daily work. My combination studio and home in Carnegie Hall was too near, so a place had to be found somewhere in the vicinity of New York. My horoscope told me that I would be successful in my search, but the first weeks of feverish motoring produced no results. Then I remembered I was in a period where success was not likely to come through my own efforts, and I began to do what I should have done in the first place intelligently non-resist. The following Sunday, I was visiting my friend Dorothy Donnelly at her place in Westchester County, just outside of New York, under the spell of the radiant autumn scenery. I exclaimed, I wish I had a home right here, on this spot. Why don't you? Asked Miss Donnelly. There's a sweet place next door, a friend's meeting house, which could be made over into just what you want. I looked at it and loved it. There was only one drawback. The reason I presumed no real estate agent had shown it to me. There was no water on the place. That made no difference to me. I knew I would find water because I had chosen a day especially fortunate for the undertaking, and I did. 5 springs pour into the waters into that astrological well, and during the dry summer season, the Adams cottage supplied water to the neighboring countryside. The name we've given this little place came from England, where the original Adams's house, forebears of New England colonists, converted a similar friends' meeting house into a similar happy home and called it the Adams Cottage. Even the cow on this astrological farm followed the dictates of the stars. The other day, the farmer's wife called me on the telephone in New York to say that Jessie was giving birth to a calf. I hope, I said with a laugh, that it'll be a heifer. And sure enough, a few minutes later, the farmer himself was on my wire. I thought you'd like to know, he said, that we have a new heifer. The hours I spare each week from the studio cares I spend in this Westchester retreat, tramping over the fields where the Battle of Yorktown was once fought, and the few dollars I can spare I spend on Chinese gods for my New York studio and New England gods for my Yorktown home. Such is the simple life of an astrologer. Chapter 11, A World in Love. One of the finest things I learned from astrology that I was in love with the wrong man. Of course, I didn't know when I began my studies that the horoscope chart was capable of giving such valuable information. But girl-like, this was part of the science that I investigated first. I soon discovered, with Mr. Smith's help, Dr. Smith, that in my case there was a strong physical attraction, but little congeniality on the mental plane or spiritual plane. This knowledge, disillusioning and disheartening as it was at the time, enabled me to bring helpful influence to bear upon the lives of many, many young people. My usual method when I find a girl and a man rushing to their doom is to suggest delay. If I ask either to take my word, then the attraction is temporary and physical, that they'll feel invariably that they're exceptions and nothing could make them less interested in each other. But in many cases they have enough faith in the signs to say, oh well, if by waiting a while we're going to be much happier, we'll be on the safe side and do so. They often come back to me after waiting beyond the limit of the first physical attraction and tell me that they found out they were so completely out of harmony that they broke the engagement. This spring, a young girl came all the way to New York from Omaha to tell me she was vaguely unhappy about her engagement without having any recognizable reason for wanting to break it. And would I help her? I did. And last week I received this letter. Dear Miss Adams, on the strength of what you told me about the future, I have had broke my engagement, and I have been like a different person ever since. I feel as though I escaped from some terrible net and am set free again. Then she added, last June I met another man at a house party, and we become great friends. His dates are ... I was able to tell the girl that her home party man was well fitted to her physical, mental, and spiritually. He was well fitted to her physically, mentally, and spiritually, and I momentarily experienced the announcement of their betrothal. The wife of a well-known man visited me long ago, apparently to find out whether her husband was true to her. If I had told her all that seemed to be indicated by his horoscope, I should have said he probably was having sundry affairs of the heart. But I saw no reason for doing this. The two had much in common. Each of them had many outside interests. The chances were in favor of their getting along well together and of reaching a satisfactory adjustment in the long run. So I told her to ignore her suspicions and doubts. Often, of course, I foresee inevitable marital difficulty long before it arrives. But seldom is my long experience that I've been sure that many people to trust each other with this trust either of them with the information. Once, however, both the man and his wife were old consultants, and I knew them to be basically fine people. The man especially, according to his stars and according to his position in the community, was the type capable of great achievements. So one day, when he was asking me about matters connected to his business, I came out with a thing that had been troubling me. 3 years from now, I said, you're going to have serious trouble with your family. If you don't look out, your wife will be unfaithful to you. He laughed at the idea and told me what I already knew, that the relation between him and his wife approached the ideal. But I stuck to my story, and in 3 years, almost to the day, that man walked into my studio in Carnegie Hall and told me his wife had fallen in love with a young clerk in his employ, a man of no importance and little promise. What should he do? Well, I told him he had the immeasurable advantage of being forewarned, and that if he believed, as I did, that his wife would ultimately get over the infatuation, he was in a position to do everything possible to hasten the end. That man went back home and proceeded to act as if nothing happened. He was his usual attentive and attractive self. He encouraged his wife to ask the young man to their house, and on the occasion he showered him with attentions, sending his carriage to meet him at the station, filling his pockets with expensive cigars, and after dinner the host would plead rest of work and go upstairs to his study. Many a night, he told me afterward, he sat up there for hours looking into the space, holding his hands over his ears to keep from hearing the conversation on the floor below. Of course, the obsession wore off the wife had been encouraged to see her young Lothario openly and in her own home. The danger passed without any of the public indiscretions so common to affairs. The wife now knows the advice I gave her husband, and both of them told me many times how thankful they are for the astrology's warning. And the wife told me that if the husband had forced the issue at the time, she would have given up her home and children. When I'm consulted about the relationship between any two persons, I should, of course, have the date of each person's birth in order to cast two horoscopes. For married people, especially, both charts must be considered. Suppose a man comes because he's very unhappy in his domestic relations. One look at his horoscope and that of his wife may be enough to show me that he'll probably continue to be unhappy unless he can adjust himself to the conditions which exist. He may have been born under a sign which makes him eager, ardent, and demonstrative. His wife may have been born under one which makes her cold and phlegmatic. Or the case may be reversed. You'd be surprised if you knew how many women have come to me apologetic, almost ashamed, because they're unsatisfied in their domestic relations. When one of these ardent women marries a man whose Venus is in the bachelor sign, there's bound to be trouble and disappointment. One day last winter, a girl came to me in the studio, who was, so far as I could tell, a perfect stranger. But Miss Adams, she insisted, don't you remember me? I tried to commit suicide when I saw you before. I looked at the round, smiling face and struggled to reconcile its possessor with nervous, haggard, worn figure that had crouched before me 2 short years before. At the time, she was married to a man whose Venus was in a sign where people are apt to love their mates as if they're rare vases to be kept on a shelf in a closet, something to take out once in a while, dust, and put back. That sort of love doesn't satisfy most people, and it didn't satisfy this girl. She sank under it from health to nervous prostration almost to death. Her husband loved her, in a way, and he was forever telling her about it, but just telling didn't satisfy her. In fact, it was killing her. Have you told your mother, I asked her on that first visit, what you just told me? No, I wouldn't dare. Then she broke down. It seems that her family and friends, even her mother, could not understand why she wasn't gloriously happy with such a devoted husband, and blamed her unmercifully. You go home, I said, and tell your mother that this marriage of yours, which she thinks is so wonderful, isn't any marriage at all. That was the spring of 1925, and last week happiness shone from her eyes and played around the upturned corners of her mouth. What's made the difference, I asked her. The stars, she said, smiling. I told my mother, she told my father, and in a month I had an annulment of my marriage. Do you wonder that I read with peculiar interest on newspaper accounts of divorce cases? Often each of the parties involved has been to see me, plaintiff, defendant, and even the correspondents. In one case, 5 of the persons considered consulted me at one time or another 2 years before the public knew there was trouble. In another instance, 3 women all in love with the same man came to me. Of course, none of them knew about the others. It is an extraordinary experience to see these tangled webs of human lives. Sometimes it's a disinterested, or at least unselfishly interested fourth party who intervenes. For example, Dear Miss Adams, please send me at once the stars to tell of a young woman born ... at 20 minutes before 10 p.m. She's very unhappy. Her husband born ... seems to be transferring his affections to another. Should she divorce him, I believe he wishes her to do so, but she loves him and believes he will come to his senses in a few months. I fear a nervous breakdown for her. What can I do to make her happy? She is the dearest thing in the world to me. Do give some light on this trouble. What will be the outcome? My advice in this case was that the young woman should wait for her husband's obsession to pass. Here is a question from my letter. Unfortunately, instead of being able to indicate that trouble is passing, I fear that the fall of this year will find them further apart. Saturn will be in an unfriendly to the sun in the woman's horoscope, which is likely not only to affect her health, but drive him further away because of her lack of magnetism and understanding. Her husband's under some of the unfriendly aspects to Venus, and he will be for another 20 years. Unfortunately, the crisis has not yet passed. In fact, he's likely to be more infatuated with the other woman than he has been so far. It is for this reason that I do not consider it wise or worthwhile for his wife to be so strenuous in her attitude or to force issues. I feel almost certain that if any time between now and a year from now she should put up with him or choose between herself and this woman, because he'll choose the other woman. If a physician told a patient who was suffering from typhoid fever that she would be better after the second week, she would know he was either ignorant of his profession or insincere, as this particular disease must always run for 3 weeks before it reaches a crisis. It's exactly the same in the case of astrology. When a certain aspect starts to operate, nothing can stop it, but a patient-tolerant attitude may tide over time without too much unhappiness. I'm not in any way excusing the lack of moral consciousness on the part of this husband, but at the same time, he was perhaps just as unfortunate in marrying a woman who was destined to be unhappy in marriage, as she was in marrying a man who did not have the stability to be true to his wife. Some of my ancestors were New England ministers, and I have preached a few thousand sermons in a day. But I fear I have to come to believe in a very practical religion. Most people are honest because they're more comfortable that way, and few people are dishonest unless they've not reached the point where dishonesty makes them uncomfortable. If a person's able to take moral advice, he doesn't need it. What most people need is help. People are continually writing to me about problems of this kind, and except in extreme cases, I try to show them some way of making a success of their present failures. I find that men, like planets, have their orbits. If a woman has had the power to attract one of them sufficiently to marry her, and he temporarily goes off on a tangent, he will, if let alone, go all around the circle and return to his starting point. I always tell a woman who's in love with a married man that it all depends upon how wise his wife is, and as to whether she'll terminate the affair. If she does not wrangle and create a gulf between the two of them to be bridged over after a temporary infatuation has ceased, the wife invariably wins out. and she regains not only all of the devotion of her husband, but also his respect and admiration. They end up being greater pals than ever. All the man learns through his experience and growth, and the growth the wife gets through her suffering, make both of them more tolerant to each other and more capable of appreciating each other's virtues. I am not a Pollyanna, nor could be more frank to people than I am, but it makes a lot of difference now how I put things. I may find that after I've set down the date, the hour, and the place and birth, and consulted my books to determine the position of the planets before me, is a subject of most conflicting influences. It would be easy to scare the poor man to death by stressing the evil influences, but it's just as easy and far more true to warn him about the tendencies in the wrong direction and show him, by cultivating and encouraging the good influences, that he can drive out the bad. Since the war, I find quite a change in the attitude of men toward women. Their minds do not seem to run as much on sex as on mental and spiritual companionship. Their first desire is that a woman should have sympathetic understanding and to be a companion to their pleasure. They tell me that they find more real companionship through marrying a woman who has a business career than a pink tea woman. This has become so much of a fact that wealthy girls have come to me to ascertain how they can secure a business position so they can find many men of their interests, as they find so many of their men friends marrying business women. But even men who support and seek business women for wives are not always responsible as they might be. I have a stenographer of whom I'm very fond. She's been planning for a long time to marry a man in Salt Lake City. The man was all right, well fitted to her, and I've encouraged the match as both friend and astrologer. But I advised her to wait a bit because the young man was coming under bad conditions financially. So she decided to postpone the wedding. But when she wrote to her fiancé that the stars suggested delay, she got a wire back. Let the stars wait, I can't. That wasn't the end of the story. The day was set for Tuesday the following week. The girl gave her notice and was turning over her desk to her successor when she received another wire from Salt Lake City. It read, "Must postpone wedding, have lost job." The stars are not to be trifled with even by lovers, nor are they to be beaten. I never undertake and introduce the right people to one another, nor assume any responsibility for assorting couples who have obviously done a poor job for themselves. My profession is astrological, not matrimonial, and there is only one occasion on record where I deliberately mixed the two. But in that case, I knew one of the parties, the woman, as well as I know anyone in the world. She happened to see the horoscope of the young man that she knew enough about astrology to be interested immediately. I would like, she said, to see the owner of this horoscope, and so it was arranged. The man came from Boston, and he met her in my studio. Nothing happened right away, but about 2 months later, the young man was leaving the Commodore Hotel to take the Knickerbocker for Boston. The porter was walking in front of his bags, and suddenly he felt the urge, the young man, not the porter, to go again and see the lady who'd been attracted by his horoscope. He went to the telephone and called her up. It was 20 minutes to 1. She told him she had an appointment at 1 o'clock, but that he could come right up, and she would see him for a few minutes. He gave up his train and came to see the lady. 2 years later, they were married. Did it turn out happily for him? I hope so. I was the woman. This concludes part 4 of A Bowl of Heaven, author Evangeline, the renowned astrologer Evangeline Adams, niece of President John Quincy Adams. In part 5, we'll resume with chapter 12 on astrological marriages, as she titles it, My Own and Others. Thank you. I hope you're enjoying this fireside book story.